The morning of October 25, 1944, broke slowly over the Philippine Sea. A pale, washed-out dawn crept across low clouds and open water east of Samar. The sea was unsettled but not violent, rolling in long, heavy swells that slapped against steel hulls with dull, rhythmic force. Aboard the American destroyers of Task Unit April 3, 77, call sign Taffy 3, the night watch was ending. Coffee steamed in metal mugs. Boots echoed softly on wet decks. No one expected history to find them here. These were not capital ships. They were escort carriers and thin-skinned destroyers, USS Johnston, Hull, Heermann, built to screen, protect, and run interference. Their mission was simple: cover the landing forces at Leyte. Their weapons were modest, 5-inch guns, torpedoes meant for emergencies, radar sets never designed to see what was coming. The men wore oil-stained dungarees and life jackets faded by salt and sun. Faces were tired, alert, but calm. The sky brightened enough to reveal the eastern horizon. Light caught the edges of low clouds and turned them silver. Far to the west, rain squalls dragged dark curtains across the water, hiding everything beyond them. On the bridges, officers scanned with binoculars. On radar scopes, green lines swept clean arcs. The ocean looked empty. Too empty. Below decks, engines thrummed at cruising speed. Boilers breathed heat into steel compartments. The smell of fuel oil and seawater clung to everything. Anti-aircraft crews lingered near their mounts, helmets unbuckled, hands resting casually on cold metal. The war had taught them never to trust quiet, but quiet was all they had. At 0647 hours, radar operators aboard the escort carriers began to notice something wrong. Contacts. Not aircraft. Surface returns. Big ones. The blips multiplied and stretched across the scope in a pattern that made no sense for this sector. Bearings were confirmed. Ranges recalculated. The sea to the west was no longer empty. On the bridges of the destroyers, reports moved fast but controlled. Bearings were passed. Course changes discussed. No alarms yet. No guns elevated. Just eyes narrowing and voices lowering. Somewhere beyond the rain squalls, heavy steel was moving at speed, ships far larger than anything Taffy 3 was meant to face. The dawn had fully arrived now, and with it, the moment every sailor dreads, the instant when uncertainty hardens into threat. The calm held for seconds longer. Then the contacts grew clearer. An American destroyer turned slightly into the swell, toward the unknown, and the battle no one planned for began to take shape. At 0648 hours, the radar screens aboard the escort carriers told a story no one was prepared to believe. The green sweep lines did not show scattered aircraft or distant patrol craft. They showed mass. Long, dense returns moving fast from the west, emerging through the rain squalls beyond Samar. These were surface contacts, large ones. Too many. Too heavy. Radar operators checked their scopes again. Gain was adjusted. Bearings were replotted. The contacts did not disappear. They grew clearer. Bearings clustered between 300 and 315 degrees. Ranges closed steadily. Someone quietly said the word no one wanted to hear. Battleships. Reports moved upward. Bridge phones crackled. On the flagship escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, the Combat Information Center filled with voices and plotting grease pencils. The contacts were ordered, marked and remarked. Speed estimates exceeded 30 knots. That alone was impossible for anything except capital ships. Cruisers. Battleships. A fleet that should not have been here. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the report within minutes. He stood on the bridge, binoculars raised toward the western horizon, seeing nothing but cloud and rain. His command, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, had been assigned to provide air support, not fight a surface action. They were never meant to face the Japanese center force. But the radar did not lie. Across the water, aboard USS Johnston, Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans stepped onto the bridge wing. He was a Cherokee officer, calm, direct, and known for demanding everything his ship could give. He listened to the reports as they came in. Range. Bearing. Speed. Each update painted the same picture. Something enormous was coming out of the weather. Lookouts strained their eyes westward. The rain squalls shifted, thinning in places. For seconds at a time, shadows appeared where shadows did not belong. Tall shapes. Vertical lines that moved against the horizon. The first Japanese pagoda masts pierced the mist, black and unmistakable. Then the sea erupted. At 0659 hours, the first shell splashes rose near Taffy 3. White columns of water leapt skyward, towering over the escort carriers. The sound followed seconds later, a deep, rolling concussion that seemed to come from the sea itself. These were not cruiser guns. These were 14-inch and 16-inch naval rifles reaching out from beyond visual range. Alarms sounded. General quarters was ordered. Men ran for stations, helmets snapping on, hatches clanging shut. 5-inch guns elevated toward impossible distances. Torpedo crews pulled pins and spun valves. Smoke generators were primed. The quiet of dawn vanished in seconds. From the rain emerged the full shape of the threat: battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers in line ahead, flags snapping in the wind. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had broken through San Bernardino Strait and sailed straight into the most vulnerable American unit in the Philippines. The radar had seen what no one believed possible. Now the eyes confirmed it. And the American destroyers were already turning toward the guns. On the bridge of USS Johnston, the decision came without ceremony. The destroyer was already shaking as she increased speed, while lifting against the swell. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans stood exposed on the bridge wing, helmet secured, binoculars lowered, eyes fixed west. He understood the geometry instantly. If the Japanese guns were allowed clear lines of fire, the escort carriers behind him would be slaughtered. Johnston turned hard to port. Her narrow hull heeled as the rudder bit water and the wake curved sharply white. Engine order telegraphs rang. Boilers roared as throttles went forward to flank speed. Black smoke poured from the stacks, flattening in the wind and trailing astern. This was not a screening maneuver. It was an attack run. Around her, the sea became violent. Tall shell splashes marched closer, each one bracketing the destroyer with frightening precision. Shrapnel hissed across the deck like thrown gravel. Paint peeled. Antennas shuddered. 5-inch mounts trained toward distant silhouettes barely visible through rain and smoke. Rangefinders struggled to read numbers that kept growing smaller. Johnston's crew moved with trained urgency. Ammunition hoists clanged. Powder bags slid into breeches. Torpedo crews opened their mounts, steel doors swinging wide to the salt air. Damage control parties stood ready, hoses charged, axes laid out, knowing the first hits were only moments away. Faces were tight, focused, stripped of anything unnecessary. The American destroyer was now alone in open water, separating herself from the carriers she was meant to protect. Her thin armor offered no comfort. Her speed was her only shield. Evans kept her angle toward the enemy, presenting the smallest possible target while closing distance that should never be closed by a ship this size. Japanese cruisers began to fire in earnest. Orange flashes winked from the mist, followed by rolling thunder that flattened the air. Columns of water erupted off Johnston's bow, drenching the forecastle. The deck pitched violently. Men were thrown against bulkheads and railings, then hauled themselves back to stations without pause. Smoke generators were activated. Thick, oily clouds spread across the sea, smearing the horizon and blinding enemy gunners. The destroyer vanished and reappeared inside the drifting curtain, her course constantly shifting. Each zig and zag was calculated, buying seconds, stealing aim, daring the enemy to miss. Behind her, the escort carriers began to turn away, launching aircraft under fire, their flight decks already shrouded. Johnston did not look back. She pressed forward, guns elevated, torpedoes armed, every yard closer, tightening the noose she was throwing around an entire fleet. The smallest ship had committed to the largest fight, and there would be no turning away. Ahead of her, the range closed faster than doctrine allowed, steel racing toward steel through smoke and rain. Fire control struggled to solve the problem as shells screamed overhead, some so close the air split open. The next minutes would decide whether the carriers lived or died, and whether one destroyer could hold an entire fleet at bay. At approximately 0700 hours, USS Johnston opened fire. The order did not echo. It did not need to. Mounts 1 and 2 erupted almost simultaneously, 5-inch/38 caliber guns barking sharp, violent reports that tore through the wind. Orange muzzle flashes punched holes in the smoke. Shells arced low and fast toward shapes that dwarfed the destroyer firing them. The target was a Japanese heavy cruiser, Kumano, its towering superstructure emerging and vanishing inside rain squalls. Fire control struggled against spray and smoke, but solutions were forced through. Range was short. Dangerously short. The first salvos fell close. Then closer. Then steel struck steel. Observers on Johnston saw flashes along the cruiser's hull. One shell slammed into the bow near the waterline, tearing plates and throwing debris skyward. Another struck higher, ripping through unarmored sections, shattering equipment and scattering crew. Against a ship built to trade blows with cruisers and battleships, 5-inch shells were not meant to matter. But they did. The destroyer's guns fired as fast as men could load them. Breeches slammed shut. Barrels recoiled and returned. The deck shook with each discharge. Powder smoke mixed with funnel smoke until the air tasted metallic and burned the throat. Spent shell casings clanged and rolled across the deck, too hot to touch. Japanese return fire intensified immediately. Heavy guns answered with terrifying precision. The sea around Johnston detonated into towering white columns, each impact hammering the hull with concussion. One salvo landed so close it lifted the bow clear of the water. Men were thrown to their knees, then back to work without looking up. Fragments ripped through exposed areas. Antennas vanished. Splinters scythed across the bridge wing. The ship shuddered but did not slow. Evans stayed visible, refusing cover, one hand gripping the rail as if daring the enemy to aim higher. Orders continued to flow, clipped and controlled, carried by shouting voices and sound-powered phones. Smokescreens thickened behind Johnston, but she pushed beyond them, keeping herself between the enemy guns and the carriers retreating east. Each round fired was a challenge. Each hit forced the Japanese formation to react, to turn, to maneuver, breaking the clean geometry of their advance. The heavy cruiser altered course, forced to comb torpedo tracks and evade further fire. That hesitation mattered. It bent the enemy line. It stole momentum. It bought time measured in blood and steel. 5-inch shells continued to hammer forward. Not to destroy the giants outright, but to disrupt them. To blind them. To force caution where none had been expected. Johnston was no longer a screen. She was a blade, cutting across the front of a fleet that outgunned her beyond reason. Then a salvo found its mark. A heavy shell struck Johnston amidships. The explosion tore through the deck, igniting fires and killing men instantly. Power flickered. Communications faltered. Smoke poured upward from a new wound in the hull. The ship slowed slightly, just enough for the enemy guns to tighten their aim. Still, the 5-inch guns kept firing. As flames climbed and water rushed where it did not belong, USS Johnston pressed closer because the next phase of the fight would demand something even more dangerous than gunfire. By 0710 hours, USS Johnston had closed to torpedo range. Smokescreens thinned and shifted, revealing the enemy line in fragments, gray hulls sliding through rain, gun flashes punching outward, wakes crossing in confusion. The destroyer's speed dropped slightly as she angled for position, not to flee, but to strike. This was the moment her design had been built for. Torpedo crews moved with precision learned through repetition and fear. The Mark 15 torpedoes lay exposed in their mounts, long steel bodies slick with spray, warheads heavy with explosive. Safety pins were pulled. Gyros spun up. Course settings were locked in by hand. Each torpedo was aimed not at a single ship, but at the path of an entire formation. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans ordered the approach tightened. Johnston surged ahead through broken smoke, while lifting and falling as shells screamed overhead. Enemy fire bracketed closer now. Splashes collapsed inward. Steel fragments rattled across the deck. Still, the range closed. Ahead, the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano loomed larger, her bow cutting cleanly through the sea as she turned to unmask her guns. She dwarfed the American destroyer, armor thick, guns massive, her presence overwhelming. Yet she was now inside the envelope where size no longer guaranteed safety. At 0716 hours, Johnston fired. One by one, torpedoes dropped cleanly from their tubes and vanished into the water, white wakes streaking forward at high speed. They ran straight and true, spreading slightly to cover evasive maneuvers. The destroyer turned hard immediately, presenting a narrow target, engine screaming as she tried to outrun the response she knew was coming. Seconds stretched. The torpedoes raced unseen beneath the surface, closing the final distance faster than any shell. On the bridge, men counted silently. No one breathed easily. The sea ahead erupted. A violent explosion tore into Kumano's bow. Steel buckled. Water surged upward in a towering plume. The cruiser's forward momentum faltered as her bow crumpled and flooded. She slewed out of formation, smoke and steam pouring from the wound. The enemy line fractured again, forced to maneuver around a crippled flagship that should have been untouchable. Cheers did not come. There was no time. Japanese guns responded with fury. A salvo struck Johnston forward, blowing open compartments and killing men at their stations. Fires ignited instantly. The ship shook, staggered, but held course. Damage control teams rushed into smoke and heat, dragging hoses, pulling wounded clear, sealing what they could. Despite the damage, the torpedo attack had done its work. The enemy advance slowed. Confusion spread through the formation. Precious minutes were bought, minutes the escort carriers behind Johnston used to launch aircraft and widen the gap. The destroyer was bleeding now, her speed reduced, her silhouette clearer with every burst of flame. She had spent her heaviest weapon and paid dearly for it. But she was still afloat. Still between the enemy and the carriers. Still dangerous. And the enemy, wounded and angered, was not finished. The enemy answered the torpedo strike with overwhelming force. By 0725 hours, USS Johnston was under concentrated fire from multiple directions. Heavy cruisers and battleships shifted their guns, no longer guessing. The range had collapsed. Every salvo now came faster, closer, heavier. Shells fell like hammer blows. The sea around the destroyer erupted continuously, walls of water slamming into the hull and sweeping across the deck. Shockwaves traveled through steel frames, rattling teeth and bones alike. One direct hit tore into the forward superstructure, shredding radar equipment and killing men where they stood. Smoke and flame rolled upward, thick and choking. The bridge was hit. Communications went silent in bursts, then returned in fragments. Voice tubes were crushed. Wires sparked and burned. The ship lost steering briefly, veering off course before manual control was forced back. Evans was wounded by shrapnel but refused evacuation. He stayed visible, moving with effort now, his uniform darkened with blood and smoke. Below decks, the damage was catastrophic. Compartments flooded instantly when a shell punched through near the waterline. Men fought rising water with portable pumps and shoring timbers, working in darkness lit only by emergency lamps. The heat was brutal. The air was unbreathable. Orders were shouted by touch and memory when sound no longer carried. Gun crews kept firing. One mount was destroyed outright, its crew killed in seconds. Another continued to operate despite casualties, loaders stepping over fallen shipmates to keep the breach fed. Each round fired felt defiant, almost irrational, but necessary. Every shell sent downrange was another second stolen from the enemy. Japanese fire grew more precise. A heavy shell exploded near the aft section, ripping through depth charge racks. The charges detonated in a violent chain, blasting open the stern and lifting it partially clear of the water. Men were thrown into the sea. Others were flung against bulkheads hard enough to break bones. Fires spread unchecked for critical minutes. Despite the punishment, Johnston did not sink. Her engines still turned, though unevenly. Speed dropped, then recovered slightly. Smoke generators failed. The destroyer stood exposed, scarred and burning, an unmistakable target surrounded by giants. Casualty reports flooded what remained of the command spaces. Dozens killed. More wounded. Medical teams worked wherever space allowed, tying off limbs, packing wounds, calming the dying while shells screamed overhead. There was no safe place aboard the ship now. Yet the enemy did not pass through. The Japanese formation continued to maneuver, still cautious, still disrupted. Destroyers and cruisers shifted to engage what they believed was a larger force concealed by smoke and chaos. That miscalculation held. USS Johnston absorbed punishment meant for carriers and transports. Every hit she took spared another American ship. Every minute she remained afloat mattered. Evans knew it. The crew knew it. The ship herself seemed to know it, holding together through damage that should have ended her. By the end of the barrage, Johnston was barely recognizable. Her silhouette sagged. Her deck was littered with wreckage and blood. Flames licked from shattered compartments. But her flag still flew, torn and blackened, visible through the smoke. The enemy guns paused briefly to shift targets. That pause would decide whether Johnston could strike again or whether this was the beginning of her final stand. By mid-morning, USS Johnston was no longer maneuvering to attack. She was maneuvering to survive and to block. Her course shifted again and again, not toward victory, but toward interference. Every turn placed her between the Japanese guns and the retreating escort carriers, a battered barrier of steel and fire. Smoke from burning compartments streamed low across the sea, merging with artificial smoke laid earlier. The horizon fractured into gray layers. Through those layers, American aircraft now appeared, FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers lifting from fleeing carriers, climbing through flak and spray. They were launching because Johnston had given them time. Japanese cruisers pressed forward cautiously, unsure how many American ships still lurked inside the smoke. Their formations widened, then tightened, guns constantly adjusting. They fired at flashes, at shadows, at the memory of resistance. Each salvo aimed at Johnston was one not aimed at the carriers. Aft guns fired when they could. Ammunition was running low. Power flickered with every shock. One engine faltered, then caught again. The destroyer's speed fell below 20 knots, then climbed painfully back. She answered helm sluggishly, her hull fighting water flooding where it did not belong. Damage control parties worked beyond exhaustion. Men stripped off helmets to breathe, then pulled them back on when steel screamed overhead. Fires were beaten down with foam and seawater, only to flare again when fuel lines ruptured. Wounded sailors were laid side by side on deck, lashed down to keep them from sliding as the ship rolled. On the bridge, Evans continued to direct what remained of the fight. His voice carried even when systems failed. Orders were passed by runners when phones died. He kept Johnston angled across the enemy's advance, daring them to come through him. The Japanese destroyers began probing forward, launching torpedoes toward the smoke. Lookouts shouted warnings. Helm orders came fast. Johnston twisted the wakes by margins measured in feet, not yards. The sea foamed white where death had passed moments earlier. Behind her, the carriers widened the gap. Aircraft swarmed low over the water, attacking battleships with bombs and strafing runs meant less to destroy than to distract. The enemy's attention fractured further. Confusion layered over caution. USS Johnston was now visibly dying. Her silhouette sagged. Her list increased slightly to port. Fires burned unchecked in compartments no one could reach. Yet she remained upright, her guns firing when able, her flag still flying. The Japanese had expected a rout. Instead, they found resistance that refused to break. Minutes bled away. Ammunition stocks dropped. Casualty numbers rose. Still, the destroyer held. At last, heavier enemy units began shifting fire away, reassessing the situation unfolding around them. The carriers were no longer where they had been. The smoke hid too much. The cost of pushing forward had grown uncertain. That hesitation, born of confusion and defiance, was the space Johnston had been fighting to create. As enemy fire slackened for a moment and the smoke thinned, the battered destroyer emerged alone, exposed, and barely moving. The line had been held. But the price for holding it was about to be paid in full. By late morning, USS Johnston could no longer pretend she was simply wounded. The damage had crossed a threshold. Systems failed faster than they could be restored. Fires burned in places no hose could reach. Flooding spread through compartments already weakened by earlier hits. The ship's fight was becoming a struggle to remain afloat. Power dropped again, this time longer. Turrets froze mid-train. Fire control went blind. What gunfire continued was local, aimed by eye, cruise firing when targets appeared through smoke. The destroyer's speed bled away, each knot lost making her more vulnerable. She wallowed now, bow riding low, stern scarred and broken. Below decks, the situation turned desperate. Bulkheads bowed under pressure. Water climbed ladders. Men worked chest-deep in oil-slick flooding, passing tools hand to hand, bracing frames with wreckage torn from the ship itself. Emergency pumps ran until they burned out. When lights failed completely, sailors continued by memory, by touch, by faith in the men beside them. Medical teams were overwhelmed. The wounded filled every available space. Morphine was rationed. Bandages were torn from spare clothing when supplies ran out. The dead were covered and secured where they lay, there being nowhere else to put them. The ship rolled steadily, making every movement painful and slow. On deck, smoke thinned enough to reveal the enemy again. Japanese cruisers circled at distance now, methodical, patient. They no longer needed haste. Their shells landed with deliberate spacing, walking closer, testing what remained. Each hit felt heavier than the last. A shell tore through the engine room. Steam blasted outward, scalding everything it touched. One engine stopped permanently. The remaining shaft struggled alone, vibrating violently. The destroyer slowed to a crawl, her wake thinning to almost nothing. She was no longer maneuvering. She was drifting. Evans understood what that meant. He had pushed the ship as far as she could go. He ordered preparations for abandoning ship, not in panic, but in order. Life rafts were cut loose. Survivors were organized. Wounded who could move were helped toward the rail. Those who could not were promised return, words spoken even when certainty was gone. Enemy fire continued. One final barrage struck forward, collapsing what remained of the bridge structure. The American flag still flew, torn nearly in half, snapping weakly in the wind. Men paused only long enough to look at it before returning to their tasks. The sea rushed closer. Water poured over the deck now, not in sprays but in sheets. The list increased sharply. Metal groaned as stresses shifted through the hull. The ship seemed to sigh, a long, settling sound that no one aboard would ever forget. Evans gave his last orders calmly. He ensured the wounded went first. He refused to leave while men remained aboard. Smoke rolled thick and black, blotting out the sky. The destroyer that had charged a fleet was dying quietly now, her work done. As sailors began to slip into the water beside her, USS Johnston tilted further, her deck angling toward the sea. She was still flying her colors. And the ocean was ready to take her. By 1015 hours, the bridge of USS Johnston was barely recognizable. Steel was twisted inward, instruments shattered, windows gone. Smoke wrapped the structure in a constant gray shroud, forcing men to crouch low as the ship listed farther to port. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans remained on his feet. Wounded, burned, exhausted, he moved deliberately, checking positions, counting survivors, making certain the evacuation was disciplined and complete. Enemy shells still landed nearby, but the firing had become distant, almost indifferent. Japanese cruisers held their range, content to let gravity and flooding finish what their guns had begun. Johnston no longer answered with gunfire. Her last operational mount had fallen silent minutes earlier, its crew gone. The destroyer drifted, bow low, stern torn open, motion reduced to the slow, inevitable roll of a ship losing balance. Evans oversaw the final sequence without haste. Classified materials were destroyed. Codes were weighted and sent overboard. Wounded men were lowered first, then those able to swim. Life rafts clustered beside the hull, tossed violently by the swell. Oil spread across the water in a wide, shimmering stain, carrying smoke and debris away from the dying ship. The American flag was still secured above the wreckage, shredded but visible. It mattered. It marked the line where the ship had chosen to stand. Men paused only briefly beneath it before moving on, faces set, hands steady, refusing panic. The sea was filled with survivors now, clinging to rafts, watching the destroyer that had carried them through the impossible. As the list increased, Evans ensured no one remained trapped below. He refused assistance, refusing relief, staying until the bridge itself became unsafe. The ship groaned again, deeper this time, a sound felt through boots and bones alike. Water surged across the deck, sweeping loose equipment and memories toward the rail. At 1020 hours, USS Johnston rolled sharply. The port side dipped, then held for a moment that felt suspended outside time. Smoke thinned just enough to reveal the torn silhouette against the gray sea. The destroyer had delayed a fleet, shielded carriers, and changed the battle's course. Then the balance broke. Johnston rolled completely, her keel briefly visible before the sea closed over her. Survivors watched in silence as bubbles and debris marked the place where she disappeared, the sound of her final plunge swallowed by the open water. After the smoke cleared, the sea off Samar looked deceptively calm. Oil spread in dark sheets. Wreckage drifted. Survivors clung to rafts, listening for engines that might return. Above them, American aircraft still circled, strafing and diving, buying distance for carriers already beyond the horizon. What USS Johnston had done became clear by degrees. Japanese ships turned away. Vice Admiral Kurita broke contact and reversed course, convinced he faced stronger forces and unwilling to pay further cost. The escort carriers lived. The landings at Leyte continued. Time, purchased at impossible price, altered the day. Rescue came slowly. Destroyer escorts threaded through debris and smoke, hauling exhausted men from the water. Many were burned. Many were wounded. Many were missing. Names were called. Answers did not come. The tally was heavy, but the line had held. Reports reached command ashore and at sea. A single destroyer had charged battleships. 5-inch guns had struck a cruiser. Torpedoes had crippled an enemy flagship. The enemy advance had stalled where it should have crushed. Doctrine did not explain it. Courage did. In the weeks that followed, the story hardened into record. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans received the Medal of Honor, posthumously. USS Johnston earned a place among the Navy's most honored ships. But the measure of the action was not in medals or citations. It was in the carriers that escaped, the pilots who returned, and the soldiers who landed unopposed because a destroyer refused to yield. The ocean kept their secret, but the lesson endured for generations. War moves forward on narrow margins. At Samar, one ship made that margin. When the smoke cleared, the fleet was gone, the sea was quiet, and the question remained: how many moments like this pass unseen, held by steel and men, waiting for history to notice?